All right. So I hope you all are well and hope you had a good extended weekend. Did anybody do anything enjoyable or interesting? Sounds about right. Oh, go ahead, Ronnie.
I just slept a lot. It was great.
Yeah, that's good. I enjoy sleep. Yesterday was actually my 42nd birthday, and I spent it teaching a couple classes in the afternoon. In my existentialism class, we discussed Kierkegaard. And that was interesting because Kierkegaard died at 42. And I was teaching him on my 42nd birthday. And I didn't plan it that way. It just sort of shook out in that manner. And it was especially interesting given that the previous week we were talking about the famous Russian novelist Dostoevsky, whose Underground Man in his book, Notes from the Underground, says that I should feel ashamed of myself for living past 40. So it's been an interesting week so far. Oh, thank you for that. Appreciate that.
Hey, January birthdays. I'm turning 23 tomorrow.
Oh, well, happy early birthday. I hope you have a good one tomorrow.
Yeah.
All right, any other fun? Well, I guess, I mean, you're technically then what? I'm not a big astrology guy. Aquarius, right?
Aquarius, yes.
Yeah, so I'm on the cusp of Capricorn and Aquarius.
Yeah, I'm right, just past, yeah.
Which is supposed to mean something. I don't know what, but.
I think there is actually like specified Capaquarius, I think.
Yeah, I like that. Maybe I'll go by Capaquarius from now on. It's a more fun word in any case. But all right, so this week we're actually today. So we had our holiday on Monday, but today we're beginning our transition to really the second kind of unit of the class. So we began with preliminary details, the historical background, essential concepts, and so forth with respect to the field of ethics. And then we, in moral reasoning. And now we're transitioning to a discussion of the major moral or ethical theories that dominate even the contemporary landscape. And some of these theories are quite ancient. So for example, Aristotelian virtue theory is 2,500 years old or so. And even utilitarianism, which came about, and that's what we'll talk about primarily today, even utilitarianism, which really arose under the work of people like Jeremy Bentham in excuse me, the 18th century, and then John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, that has a kind of ancient Hellenic provenance too, with Epicureanism. So Epicurus was a Hellenistic philosopher that is after the so-called classical Hellenic period, made up of thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And so the Hellenistic world includes, beyond the Greek speaking world, even the Romans too, the emergence of Latin philosophy. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today, the inheritance of ancient Epicureanism. Okay, so let me see. If you're on the cusp, you can enter in the time you were born and where. It'll tell you what you are. Yeah, I should do that maybe. Thanks, Grace. I should check that out. All right, so we're supposed to, by the schedule, discuss chapter 4 on Monday. And that is a chapter having to do with the very nature, scope, purpose, application, and so forth of ethical theory and theorizing. So hopefully you guys were able to work through chapter 4. And if there are any questions about that, you can feel free to ask or jump in at any time. But I'm not going to spend any time on that. Although when we're talking about chapter 5, beginning with ethical egoism, and then transitioning to utilitarianism, we will have the opportunity to discuss some of the important aspects and questions and concepts that you were introduced to in chapter 4, such as the difference between considered moral judgments, the reliability of our intuition with respect to ordinary moral experience, that sort of thing, as criteria by which to test or evaluate moral theories. And so we will, if you're unclear about any of those things, we'll have some chance to talk about them today. Okay, so the idea is we will work through chapter 5 today, and then looking ahead to next week for Monday, still within this unit dealing with the major moral theories, we will then move on to discuss Kantian deontology, a version of non-consequentialism. So today we're talking about utilitarianism mostly, but also to a lesser extent, and this is how we'll begin, ethical egoism, both of which are consequentialist theories. And then, time permitting, once we work through utilitarianism, we'll talk a little bit about social contract theory if we have time. If not, we'll begin our session on Monday with that discussion. And then, so Monday, Kantian deontology, a version of non-consequentialism. And then Wednesday, we'll move on to Aristotelian virtue ethics or virtue theory. Okay, so any questions about any of that? Any issues, comments, questions, problems? All right, so I have in mind to begin our session today with some breakout rooms. But instead of having you unpack together or focus on the prompts assigned for the discussion forum this week, which is what I often do, I want to give you the opportunity to talk about a moment from the beginning of the chapter, or at least the beginning of the section on utilitarianism. So this hypothetical Dr. X, right, who's on the verge of making a great discovery in terms of solving the plague of cancer, right? So those who read the chapter will know what I'm talking about. But I'm going to share the screen for that just so we're on the same page, and then I'll put you guys into breakout rooms for a little while to kind of discuss, if not debate, where you stand in response to this particular dilemma. So let me share the screen now. All right, hopefully you all can see that. Okay, so the purpose of working through this thought experiment or exercise is for some introspection on your part to come to this incipient, at least, to some extent pre-reflective, because really just hashing out your initial orientation before coming to grapple with these problems and questions, but where you stand in connection to the theory of utilitarianism. Are you attracted to it? And you can judge your moral intuitions in response to a particular thought experiment or scenario as a kind of reflective interpretation of that position. So here's the thought experiment. And we'll actually, in the course of today's discussion, entertain a number of these kind of exercises or thought experiments. And so there's a really famous one that I'm sure, if not all of you, most of you have heard of, and it's the trolley problem. So I know a number of you are familiar with the show The Good Place, and it comes up more than once, I think, in that show. But we'll talk a little bit about the trolley problem. And this can be perhaps perceived as a version of that. So, okay, are you a utilitarian? To find out, consider the following scenario. Sorry, I got some stupid Adobe message interrupting my view here. Hold on. God damn it. Where am I? Okay, can everyone see that again? Are we on the same page? All right, cool. So, are you a utilitarian? To find out, consider the following scenario. After years of research, a medical scientist, we'll call her Dr. X, realizes that she is just one step away from developing a cure for all known forms of heart disease. Oh, it was heart disease, not cancer. Sorry. Such a breakthrough would save hundreds of thousands of lives, perhaps millions. The world could finally be rid of heart attacks, strokes, heart failure, and the like, a feat as monumental as the eradication of deadly smallpox. That one last step in her research, however, is technologically feasible, but morally problematic. It involves the killing of a single healthy human being to examine the person's heart tissue under a microscope just seconds after the heart stops beating. The crucial piece of information needed to perfect the cure can be acquired only as just described. It cannot be extracted from the heart of a cadaver, an accident victim, someone suffering from a disease, or a person who has been dead for more than 60 seconds. Dr. X decides that the benefits to humanity from the cure are just too great to ignore. She locates a suitable candidate for the operation, a homeless man with no living relatives and no friends, someone who had not been missed. Through some elaborate subterfuge, she manages to secretly do what needs to be done, killing the man and successfully performing the operation. She formulates the cure and saves countless lives. No one ever discovers how she obtained the last bit of information she needed to devise the cure, and she feels not the slightest guilt for her actions. So here's the question. Did Dr. X do right? If you think so, then you may be a utilitarian. A utilitarian is more likely to believe that Dr. X's action was right because of its consequences. It brought about consequences that were more good than bad. One man died, but countless others were saved. If you think that Dr. X did wrong, you may be a non-consequentialist. A non-consequentialist is likely to believe that Dr. X did wrong because of the nature of her action. It was murder. The consequences are beside the point. Okay, so is everyone clear on the scenario there? What's going on? What's at stake? So the idea is I'll put you guys into some breakout rooms and you can just sort of discuss with each other where you as individuals stand in considering the details and conditions of this event, of this action in particular. So judging by your basic sort of pre-reflective moral intuition, that is before digging too deeply into the questions involved, what do you think? Did Dr. X do right or not? And then you can, beyond that point, move a little bit further in the direction of deepening and qualifying your view or your interpretation in various ways. So I just want to give you guys a chance to consider these things together in a small group, right? And then we'll talk about it together. And I also have pulled up a pretty hilarious, but also useful comic from the great existential comics series that talks about utilitarianism and shows in a fun way some flaws, to put it mildly, with that theory. Okay, so does that make sense? Are there any questions about that before I make the groups? All right, cool. So I will create these breakout rooms now, and I'll make five breakout rooms. So each room will have 4 students. So I'll go ahead and open those up now. And as usual, I'll let you know when you should start concluding your conversation to rejoin us. All right. Hey guys, welcome back. Let's just wait for the others to rejoin us. Okay, looks like we're all here. So, with this super fun thought experiment, does anyone want to start us off with some answers that you guys might have shared with each other in response to this? Um, I imagine there are some interesting conversations. Anybody want to volunteer? Sure, Raphael, go ahead.
So basically, in my group, we basically all agreed that she made the right decision, but the way she did it was kind of wrong. Like, she could have at least given the guy a choice, or like made an announcement saying that if you do this, you'll save, because I saved millions of lives. Because I feel like at least if there's a few people in this world that'd be willing to do that for the greater good. So
then it's the subterfuge bit, the deception, that you find troublesome morally.
yeah.
And that's possibly too what is operative in making the action performed murder rather than something a little bit less salacious, to put it mildly. So if the guy had actually agreed to it, well, then maybe it's not murder, although it could still be ethically disturbing for some other reasons, right? So good. I think that's an important point. Anybody? So other thoughts? So Raphael, which group are you in? Let me see. I still have the groups. I think you're in room 4. Okay. Yeah, so I'd like to hear, if possible, from someone from each of the 5 rooms. So does anybody else want to jump in?
In group 3, I was kind of saying, they were trying to say like the homeless man doesn't have any family and like trying to dehumanize him like that. And I didn't like the way they did that, because he's still a person and we can't just, oh, he has no family, he has no rights, like just skip him up.
Yeah, so why, I mean, that's a good comment. I mean, it's important. Why do you think that those details were included in the thought experiment? Why is it significant that this person...
Because she was like getting away with it. So then if he had family, then they would have maybe like looked into it a little, you know, and tried to figure out where he went.
Well, sure, in terms of the criminality of the act, that's something to consider, but why else? And this is in connection specifically to utilitarianism as a theory. So why is it morally significant by the lights of utilitarianism that this particular person had no family and no one gave a shit about him?
Because then the family isn't hurting, so then there's no consequence of hurting the family.
Good, good. So from a utilitarian perspective, the more pain and suffering that would be brought about as a result of a particular choice or action, the worse, consequentially speaking, that action has to be understood. And so if it's really only the homeless person himself who would be suffering at all, and then if you compare that to the vast, innumerable individuals now and in the future who would benefit from this discovery, the resolution of all heart ailments, well, comparatively, it's not even comparative, it's not comparable, right? The good would outweigh the bad. So that's why it's an important detail. And then it becomes, on that basis, a kind of quantitative consideration. So the more happiness, the more pleasure, which means precisely in terms of the inverse, the less pain, the less suffering, then the better the act. So good. So who else? So someone from the other rooms. We still have, I think, 1, 2, and 5. Right? Does anybody from those rooms want to say anything? Oh, go ahead, Hunter.
Cool. This exercise really felt like we were trying to identify guilt. It felt like the reason she felt bad was because, she felt guilty, not because she killed this person. Like, I mean, she felt guilty because she killed the person, of course, but like the exercise in guilt, she didn't seem to have that initial like, oh, I'm going to worry about killing this guy. Like she instead dehumanized him to the point of, oh, he has no family, he has no friends, I can kill this guy. And then afterwards is like, I feel really guilty about killing this guy. maybe I should hide that. So that way no one has it, show a blemish on my work, because then it might say, it might cost her something, right? But it's all an exercise in guilt where she is only considering the ethics of it because she's done something wrong and someone else is going to catch her for it. And that, in my eyes, is what's wrong. You could kill a person, the ends could justify the means, but she didn't even consider it until she felt guilty.
Is that right though?
I don't know, but like
kind of-
that's
I moved away from the page. I can try to go back to it, but I think it explicitly says that she did not feel guilty. She felt no guilt at all about it, right? Because she judged by the criteria of the utilitarian moral theory that the good is precisely synonymous with the maximization of happiness or the minimization of suffering, right? So by those lights, one would have no reason to feel guilty insofar as guilt is the byproduct of moral failure. But in this case, it would be a moral victory, right? Because one had done what one should do. One had fulfilled the ought. One had fulfilled the obligation to do good or to do right. Yeah, so I think that an important part of that scenario is that she didn't feel guilt, right? But in any case, I think what you said is worth considering. So in light of guilt, someone who subscribes to a utilitarian point of view might use that point of view as a theoretical orientation instrumentally in order to, in a preliminary fashion, to wash one's hands of any potential guilt that could emerge from it. So if you say, as a moral agent, I want to do what's good. And then the next step is what's good is maximizing happiness or minimizing pain. And then if you see the path to that, practically or concretely speaking, you actualize the possibility, you perform the action, you make it happen, and then what have you done? Well, you've introduced more good into the world than bad, so you really have no reason to feel bad about it, right? But I think, Hunter, you're perhaps calling attention to something problematic about that, right?
what if that action's bad?
What's that?
Yeah, what if that action's bad? That's what it comes down to.
So it could have brought about, sure, it's undeniable that if the details surrounding this case are true, that the action of this particular researcher or doctor brought about goodness into the world. That's undeniable. But then a different question is whether or not that's sufficient to make it morally right. And so if you think that moral rightness is precisely interchangeable or synonymous with maximizing good or minimizing pain, well, then it would be. But it's controversial, to say the least. There are other ways to go about noting or understanding the relationship between right and good. And so, as we'll see next week, Immanuel Kant thinks that there is a pretty significant distinction to be made between the good and the right. If we understand good in terms of a situation that is one in which any kind of suffering or pain or dissatisfaction is relatively mitigated, there's something important about that, right? We all want to be happy, for example. No one wants to deny that, but that doesn't mean that we ought to pursue happiness at all costs, because it could mean that there is, or it could be rather, that there is some pole or criterion of rightness which stands opposed to or radically or even subtly different from this other normative pole of goodness, right? And so that's how Kant thinks, as we'll see. He actually identifies rightness or right with law. And actually the German language is very helpful for that, because the word recht can mean simultaneously, depending on the context, right, in the sense of moral rights, or what is right versus wrong, but it also means law. And so that's how Kant understands it. But we'll talk more about that next week. So you raise a good point. So Others want to jump in? What are some other thoughts that might have come up there?
Another thing that our group kind of talked about was the like the meaning and the value that the doctor took away from this person's life by keeping it a secret, you know, because his life was given for such an amazing scientific discovery, but no one would ever know about it. And I think that kind of, I don't know, it takes away just the meaning and the importance of what he gave his life to.
Yeah, that's a really important point that perhaps we haven't considered, or others haven't considered, a different direction to the wrongness that might have been performed in this scenario. So insofar as it's pretty clear that this homeless person, whether voluntarily or not, made a tremendously valuable sacrifice that ought to be recognized, right? And so the murder is one thing, but then to compound the wrongness on top of the murder, there's a lack of important recognition for the gravity of the sacrifice and the beneficent contributions that that sacrifice would make for the world at large. So there seems to be more than one moral wrong in this particular situation. Others, did anyone else have different thoughts on this? So as we read in the scenario, Dr. X seems to, and this is indicated by the lack of guilt, as we mentioned, Dr. X seems to justify the action on the basis of whether conscious or not, some moral, ethical, theoretical orientation, in this case, utilitarianism. But what version of utilitarianism is it that she uses to justify this action? Is it act utilitarianism or rule utilitarianism? And would there be an important difference depending upon which you turn to or embrace? So for those who read chapter 5, you might have a good answer to this, but what do you think? So was she justifying the action through act or rule utilitarianism?
It was through act utilitarianism.
Yeah, and why is that? So what makes it act utilitarian?
Because she just, I don't know exactly how to answer that, but just because she went more on like her, rather than considering rules and the outcome, she just went on her actions and doesn't think like she should have followed the rules morally, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, so she didn't, I mean, you're right. It was an example of defense by act utilitarianism because the doctor or researcher in this role did not take the crucial step of abstractly reformulating a kind of explanatory understanding of what her action would mean in terms of overall social rules, right? So she could have said, this action might imply the justificatory embrace of a particular societal norm. And I think that if that norm were justly recognized and disseminated through society at large, it would be better, right? She didn't take that step. Instead, she's just considering the consequences of her particular action rather than the consequences of a rule that could be put forward to make sense of that kind of action, socially speaking. So if she were to do that, it's clear that she would have perhaps come to a very different conclusion, right? She might have said something like, well, a society in which, as a rule, it seems to be acceptable to kidnap homeless people and to force them to sacrifice their lives for the betterment of the whole, well, that might actually lead us into a pretty fucked up society. So perhaps we shouldn't do it, right? So then we can see that whether or not you start from the point of view of act or rule utilitarianism, you can come to some pretty dramatically different conclusions, right? Okay. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that one couldn't propose a rule that would end up justifying the decision, right? It just means that the conclusions don't necessarily match coming from either rule or act utilitarianism, although they can. Okay. So any other comments or points or questions about this?
I dropped like a critical thinking one in the chat. It was like,
Oh, okay.
well, if this product failed, do you think with her moral values of like, I could kill this person to create this cure, would she instead, not creating that cure or whatever, just keep killing people? Would she be onto her 5th victim by the time she decides, oh, it's ready for production?
Yeah, so if she tries it with the first homeless person, it fails for whatever reason, well, maybe she perfects some deficiency in the first approach and then thinks, well, I'll try it again. And then for whatever reason, it doesn't work. And then she keeps doing it. What then? Well, by utilitarian lights, if we're really focused on, in terms of what good is or right, the concrete consequences, the result, practically speaking, of her actions, I think even from the point of view of act utilitarianism, we would have to say what she's done is wrong. And in fact, what she's done repeatedly is wrong, because nothing good has come of it. You kill one guy, well, there's death and nothing beneficial. You kill another one, well, more death, still nothing beneficial. But then let's say she does it 10 times. And on the 10th go, it works out. And now she saves tens of thousands of lives from heart disease. Well, now it suddenly, perhaps even still from the interpretation of act utilitarianism, becomes good, which means you have to retrospectively look back at all of those individual deaths and say, well, you know, it might not have been for the best at that time, but seeing now the eventuality of this series of decisions and actions, we might say that it's ultimately for the good. But that strikes me as strange, right? Okay. So yeah, that's a really good point. So now I want to share the screen and just take some time for fun to look at this existential comic. Is anyone familiar with the existential comics series? If you've taken other classes with me, then you've seen them, but there's a huge number of these comics, and you can find one in the archive, or rather you can find a number of these comics in the archive that are searchable by philosopher, by theme or topic, by historical period, and so forth. So let me share the screen. Okay. So in this particular comic, it's like a game show scenario where Jeremy Bentham, the founder of modern utilitarianism, is the host. And so the game show is called The Last Chance at Happiness. So I'll just move slowly through the various panels so we can all read it. And let me know if I'm going too quickly. So I hope you enjoy that comic. um, so the poor philosophy grad student is going to die, and poor alcoholic Pete is going to get the liver, right? So what do you guys think about that?
I think it did a really good job of kind of pointing out some of the shortcomings of this aspect or this perspective.
Yeah, so one flaw, one thing to which critics object about utilitarianism is that, and this has to do with its poor ability of handling issues of rights, issues of justice, is and also respect, right? Respect for persons, respect for personhood or agency as such. And so Ronnie, I think you were talking a little bit about this, or it might have been someone else earlier, when calling attention to the dehumanizing of the homeless person without any family. And this is because from the perspective of utilitarianism, people, individuals, are only valuable to the extent that they are, so to speak, containers for happiness, right? It's only pleasure or happiness, and that's exactly what utilitarians mean by happiness. They mean pleasure. It's really only pleasure as a quantifiable content that has value. And in fact, from the perspective of utilitarianism, it has intrinsic value, as opposed to mere extrinsic or instrumental value. And in fact, more strong than that, from the point of view of utilitarianism, pleasure is the only thing that actually has intrinsic value. That is to say, pleasure is the only thing that's valuable or pursuable in itself for its own sake. So a logical consequence of that would be, if you have a smaller quantity in your little container of personhood of this thing, this phenomenon, pleasure, which is the only intrinsic value in the world, well then, because you have an insufficient quantity of this content, well then it stands reason that you share less in intrinsic value. So getting rid of you, forgetting about you, killing you, or sacrificing you, or whatever, compared to doing the same to someone who, so to speak, has a greater quantity or share in pleasure, again, the only intrinsically valuable thing, would make total sense, right? But people like Kant and other non-consequentialists think, well, there's something fishy about that. Morality can't be determined by abstract quantity alone. When it comes to certain actions, there seems to be something qualitatively heavy or burdensome or imposing or important about them, right? And so, yeah, are there any questions about that, or final comments? So I have some slides that I've prepared to work through for the chapter, and we are going to talk a little bit about egoism, because consequentialism is a generic kind of moral theoretical approach, which has different versions or species of it, of which a couple are utilitarianism and egoism. So we'll talk about those. But are there any questions before I pull up the slides? Okay. All right, so let's dig in more deeply to consequentialism. So what exactly is consequentialism? Well, it's a moral theory, and moral theories, to put it really simply, and this should be familiar for those who read chapter 4, moral theories are efforts to explain the source or the meaning of the goodness or rightness as determinations of particular actions, choices, states of affair, events, and so forth. And so we tend to think, because of our pre-reflective moral intuitions, that certain behaviors, events, or actions are bad or good. A moral theory would not decide necessarily which are to be determined as good or bad, but would in any case provide some explanatory clarity or illumination about why it is that we think these things, and to give us a means by which to bring into a kind of at least operative or functional harmony some aspects of our moral intuition or considered moral judgments that might sometimes stand in tension or contradiction with each other. So that's what a moral theory is very broadly. So then a consequentialist moral theory, in its effort to explain what it is that determines the difference between good and bad, right and wrong, would, as the name suggests, focus on the consequences, the outcome, the result of actions, right? So as Vaughan lays out in the chapter, there's something really prudential and straightforwardly attractive about this, right? I mean, after all, if how you behave in the world, the choices you make, the actions you take, and so forth, don't bring about consequences or results that we would think to be good, well then, what's the point of evaluating them? What are we really evaluating them for, right? We want our actions to lead to good. That is, good results. And so there's something really attractive. There's something really straightforwardly appealing and rational, I would say, about this approach, right? Okay, but that being said, various approaches, because remember, consequentialism, as I said, is a general or generic theory under which there are various versions or species. And so some of those versions or species are going to fare better than others in the light of our criteria by which we evaluate or judge the efficacy of moral theories. And those criteria are, how well does the theory square with our ordinary moral experience, right? So what does that mean? Well, what are some dimensions of our ordinary moral experience? Well, we think, for example, that we sometimes have to judge actions or situations, right? So judgment is sometimes in order. We also, by examining our typical moral experience, note that we often find ourselves, when making these evaluative judgments, in disagreement with each other, right? And so those are just a couple of points. And we also, so another aspect of our moral experience is we sometimes find that we are wrong, we're mistaken about our moral judgments. So another criteria would be considered moral judgments. How well does the theory in question square with those considered moral judgments? So what are examples of considered moral judgments? Does anyone remember or have a sense of what I'm talking about here from the reading or just in general? So what is a considered moral judgment, and can someone give an example? Anybody?
I think is it like actual moral decisions kind of that we come to, or like conclusions that we reach on a given situation which we might have to determine, whereas like as contrary to moral theories, which is where you're kind of trying to figure out what the conclusion is.
Yeah, good. So a moral judgment would be, or a considered moral judgment specifically, would be after some reflection, after some relatively deep thinking on a particular issue, your intuition, that is the very kind of process or pathway through which you are making these considerations in the first place, they are brought to a place of good sense. So through the moral theoretical openings that we have, these dominant moral theories. But a considered moral judgment in itself is something that we come to without necessarily having recourse to moral theories, but in any case, we do have recourse to our experiences in the world. And so just a quick example of what a moral judgment and a considered moral judgment, even more so would be, is something like innocent people should not be punished, right? So that's a considered moral judgment. We tend, it's very abstract, it's very general, it's not fleshed out by any details really, but we think all things being equal, all factors considered, that if you are not guilty of a particular crime or action for which punishment would be in order, you shouldn't be punished. And then on the other side, we tend to think if you are guilty of perpetrating a moral crime or of violating a moral norm, you should be punished or judged harshly or whatever, as the case goes. So another considered moral judgment might be something like equals should be treated equally. Right? So if we are equals, for example, before the law, then morally speaking, if we're dealing with a moral legal system, well, then we ought to be treated equally, right? There shouldn't be more than one legal system. So those are considered moral judgments, which means if a certain theory that we're putting into play in order to illuminate or make sense of and to bring into meaningful concert are considered moral judgments, if it turns out by the lights of such a theory that that judgment doesn't work, or that it is excluded or falsified or overturned, namely that equals should be treated equally, well then we should be very careful and pay some close attention to that theory because it's very likely to be flawed, right? But just because it fails, a moral theory fails when compared to or brought into consideration with a considered moral judgment, isn't necessarily sufficient to get rid of the theory. It just means that that's an indication that we have to do some more deep thinking. We have to see why there seems to be a disconnect there. Okay. So two of the most famous versions of consequentialism would be egoism, and there are different variations of that still, and utilitarianism. And as we've seen already, briefly, there are different versions of that. So let's deal with egoism, and we're going to spend our focus on ethical egoism, but we will also have to talk about psychological egoism as it arises in the chapter. But ethical egoism is sometimes referred to as rational egoism. So if you encounter that term in the literature, in the ethical literature and discourse, those are synonymous, right? It's not a different version. So ethical and rational egoism are the same. And some of the major theoreticians behind this approach would include someone like Ayn Rand, whom I talked about briefly before. Some, I think, misguidedly attribute a version of ethical egoism to Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German existential thinker. Also, Thomas Hobbes is sometimes referred to as an ethical egoist. And I think that's accurate. I think that's right. And we'll talk, if we have time today, we'll talk a little bit about Hobbes because he's the progenitor of the long and storied and very much important social contract tradition, which gave birth, among other things, to our existing system of government, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. So what is ethical or rational egoism? It's the ethical theory, which is a normative or a prescriptive theory. So all ethical theories, as opposed to scientific theories, for example, are normative or prescriptive, whereas scientific theories, by contrast, are descriptive. So it's a very crucial distinction to hold on to and gain clarity of, and I'll talk about it in some detail in a couple of slides. But so ethical egoism is the moral, that is normative theory, that right action is the one that promises the most favorable balance of good over evil for oneself, right? So for yourself, hence the name, egoism, right? So an egoist is someone who thinks, right and wrong is determined in virtue of the goodness or badness that is projected to happen upon my action, but where the goodness and badness at issue is applied specifically to the agent who is making these considerations, right? So it wouldn't be applied to anyone else, at least not directly, at least not immediately. But it's important to note that self-interest is not necessarily selfishness. So some of these theorists behind egoism fudge that distinction. So I'm considering in particular Ayn Rand, who has a famous essay called The Virtue of Selfishness, because she provocatively really tries to identify self-interest with selfishness. But that's a problem that doesn't necessarily attend to all versions of egoism, right? Because we can make a clear distinction between self-interest and selfishness. And this is something that Thomas Hobbes does. So the 17th century English philosopher who created social contract theory, as we'll talk about later. And so then if we decouple self-interest from selfishness, then we don't have to necessarily conclude that this theory brings us to a valorization or embrace of wanton self-indulgence or recklessness. But can anyone, perhaps with some clarity, explain what it is that separates selfishness from self-interest? So what's the difference? Can anyone maybe think of an example that showcases the difference, or can you perhaps define the difference?
I think I have some kind of definition. I definitely don't have an example though. But I think one might say that self-interest is looking out for yourself, but not necessarily like negatively affecting others. Whereas selfishness is looking after yourself while at the expense of others, essentially.
Great, perfect. Yeah, that's a beautiful way to distinguish them. So you could say that selfishness is self-interest, but at the expense of others, at the expense of the self-interest of others. And so, for example, no one would say you're selfish because you decide to go to the dentist, right? That's not a selfish act or decision, yet it's most certainly in the self-interest of one's bodily health, one's dental health. But let's say you go to the dentist to undergo an operation to replace your teeth with some really fancy veneers, while your child is going hungry or doesn't have clothes to wear to school, or themselves has a face full of horrific and painful cavities, right? Well, then we would consider the actions of such a parent selfish. Why? Because they are pursuing this self-interested outcome specifically at the expense of the health of their children, their wards, those over whom they have some kind of obligation as a caretaker, right? So that's an example to highlight the difference between selfishness and self-interest. Okay. And so it's also not synonymous with self-indulgence or recklessness, because you can be an egoist and note that even if you really enjoy the pleasures of food and alcohol, that is, they give you pleasure, they make you happy, if you gorge yourself on food and drink yourself into a stupor, and you do this repeatedly, well, at some point that balance or dynamic of pleasure is going to turn the tide. It's going to go in the other direction, and it's going to be mostly pain. And the same thing goes if you decide to avoid the dentist because of what you perceive as your self-interest. You don't want to have to go through the pain of dental work if you need like a root canal or something. So you say it's my self-interest to avoid going to the dentist, but in the long run, that's really not going to work out in the favor of your self-interest, right? So you can have the foresight of someone who takes seriously projected consequences into the future, because remember, we're talking about consequentialism here, and not just immediate consequentialism. So ethical egoism also is not the same as doing whatever one desires or simply whatever gives you pleasure at the moment for the reasons I just mentioned. Because even ethical egoists have to consider the long-term effects. And so Epicurus, I mentioned, was the kind of ancient progenitor of what would come about in the 17th century in the form of modern utilitarianism, but you can also see some egoism at play in his thought. And so Epicurus notes thousands of years ago that the pursuit of pleasure often necessitates the experience of pain, right? You sometimes have to go through painful things if that promises greater pleasure as a result, as a consequence of it. And also that means on the other side, you have to forego what promises immediate pleasure because you're long-sighted enough to recognize that such repeated or constant enjoyment might in the end bring about greater pain or suffering. And then lastly, this also doesn't mean just going about like a total asshole and doing whatever the fuck you want, because you'll often antagonize people. You'll make them mad. And if you make everyone mad because you're constantly pursuing your own selfish desires, well, then people are gonna gang up on you and they're gonna make you pay in the end. And so you won't be happy. So then you still have to be politic to the extent that you at least pay lip service to the individual desires and expectations of others, because after all, you have to exist in a society and you benefit quite substantially from the existing norms that stand in the place of that society, that adjudicate matters of justice and immorality and so forth. Okay. So I talked a little bit about psychological egoism a moment before to distinguish that from ethical or rational egoism. So ethical egoism, sometimes called rational egoism, are both versions of consequentialist moral theory. That is because they explain what it is that makes an action or a state of affairs right versus wrong. And it's precisely what promises the greatest amount of pleasure or the least amount of pain as a result of a particular choice or action. But then there's also psychological egoism, but it's important to note, and Lewis Vaughan in chapter 5 does not do a good job of this at all, I don't think. It's very important to note that psychological egoism is not a moral theory. It is a psychological theory, and insofar as we understand psychology to be a social science, it is a kind of scientific theory, which means that rather than being prescriptive or normative, it is descriptive. Right? So what is the difference between a descriptive theory like psychological egoism and a prescriptive theory like rational egoism or ethical egoism? Does anyone, this might be a little confusing or vague, and this isn't something Vaughan discusses in the chapter, but does anyone have an answer for that? So what distinguishes a prescriptive or normative theory from a descriptive one?
Would it be that like a descriptive one is describing things more so, whereas prescriptive one, and no, I lost it.
But what is, yeah, so descriptive, it describes, right? And when you describe something that is, right? You describe something that exists, right? So I can come up perhaps with, for example, a descriptive theory that strives to make sense of why cats purr, right? So a scientist might be involved in that kind of research. They might be experimenting in various ways on cats to figure out why they purr. So when they propose a theory that would explain that, They are describing in greater detail what happens when this event in the world happens itself, namely when cats are purring. But an ethical or prescriptive theory, for example, ethical egoism, says an action is right if it serves an individual's self-interest. So what is a crucial difference between those two theoretical explanations?
With the prescriptive one, there's no like physical or like, you know, substance to it, I guess, you know, like with the cats and the descriptive one, there's an object or something physical and real, not conceptual.
And then so that's good. Now we'll go to the prescriptive side. You're not necessarily characterizing or trying to explain or delimit what is or what has happened, but instead you're trying to explain what ought to happen. So as a moral theorist, if I subscribe to egoism, I say you ought to do whatever is in your self-interest. Well, that presupposes that you might fail at it, right? So if I tell you, you should pursue your self-interest, I only say that in part because I recognize that you might not pursue your own self-interest, right? Just like if I say, using whatever moral theory I want, that you should not lie or you should not kill. When I say that, I have in mind that you might actually do those things, that you might lie and you might kill, and so you should not, you ought not. Whereas if I tried to theoretically define or illuminate why it is that cats purr, there's no ought language involved. There's no should language involved. I'm not concerned about whether or not my cat should be purring while sleeping on my chest or whatever at night. I'm saying my cat is purring and here's why, right? So this is an important difference. When in considering a descriptive, say, scientific theory, and that theory is found to be at odds with reality. It doesn't match reality. So my theory that purports to explain why cats purr, if through empirical investigation I figure out somehow that my explanation is false, that the previous answer I gave does not really adequately capture why cats purr, well then I have to change my theory, right? I change my theory to square with the facts. But when it comes to moral theories, which are prescriptive, not descriptive, so like a doctor, for example, you go to a doctor because you're sick, and after a diagnosis, they provide some sort of plan by which, if you follow the measures suggested, you will perhaps overcome your ailment. That doesn't mean once the doctor gives you this medicine that you're going to take it. It means that you should take it, right? If you want to feel better, you should take the medicine. So that's what prescription means. So when I say prescriptively, using whatever theory I want, that you should not murder because murder is wrong, or you should not lie because lying is wrong, and it turns out that someone does lie or someone does murder, well, I don't change the reality, or excuse me, I don't change my theory. I don't say, oh, well, people do murder. Okay, well, I guess my theory that murder is wrong, morally wrong, is falsified. I should throw it out the window, right? Or if I find that someone actually lies in a specific circumstance, I don't change the theory. I don't say, oh, well, I guess lying is fine after all. I say, yeah, you should not have lied. Or I say, you should not have murdered. So when there's a disconnect between a moral that is prescriptive theory and reality or the world, well, then we think that reality or the world needs to be changed and modified. But when it comes, again, just so we're clear, when it comes to a descriptive theory, if there's a disconnect between the theory and the world, we change the theory, right? So that's important to keep in mind, because psychological egoism basically says, and this is in concert with some approaches in biology and the social sciences, it basically says that all human beings are motivated by self-interest. So that aims to describe some aspect of human nature, right? So it's describing what humans are. It's saying we can only act in pursuit of our own betterment, our own self-interest, whatever we think will serve our own interest at the moment of decision. But that is descriptive, not prescriptive, right? So that's why I pose this question, because Lewis Vaughan says that most versions of ethical egoism use psychological egoism to support it. But that's problematic, and for a couple reasons. One reason being one that we considered already, although I kind of, if I recall from last week, I had to move through the slide, but I encourage you to go back to it, the slideshow for chapter 3, where I talk about the is-ought fallacy from David Hume, the Scottish philosopher from the 18th century. So just because something has been the case as a matter of fact for a long time, or maybe not so long of a time, that is not sufficient to prove that it should be the case, right? You cannot derive as a matter of logic an ought from an is. That is, you cannot derive a normative, that is ethical theoretical conclusion, from premises which are descriptive, which are purely descriptive. There has to be something that brings them into union with each other, some third term, some mediating third term. So for example, and I'm just using this as an example, it's something commonly heard when people defend capitalism, for example. They say, well, capitalism is the economic system that the US has always subscribed to or endorsed. Therefore, it ought to be that way. We're a capitalist country, therefore we ought to stay a capitalist country. Well, you know, there are many virtues, of course, to speak of with respect to capitalism. That's not the point. The point is, that's not a good argument. Because just because something has been the case doesn't mean that it should be the case. You need some other reason that gives you the ought that's not grounded in the descriptive is. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that? Okay. So getting a little behind here, I want to kind of move quickly. But this is from the textbook. This is the argument that Vaughan supplies to bring into relationship the premises of psychological egoism as a means to bring us to the conclusion of rational egoism as a moral theory. So premise 1 says, we are not able to perform an action except out of self-interest. That's essentially psychological egoism. So it describes what we are able to do. It purports to characterize human nature. Premise 2, we're not morally obligated to perform an action unless motivated by self-interest. So that is a premise of rational egoism or ethical egoism. And then the conclusion, therefore, we are morally obligated to do only what our self-interest motivates us to do. Okay. So before we move on, and it bothers me really that Vaughan doesn't talk about this at all in the textbook, but does anyone see, and this is perhaps subtle, maybe too subtle, but does anyone see a major, just glaring problem with this argument?
Well, personally, I'm having a problem with the second premise.
And why is that?
It just doesn't seem like something that you can say objectively. There are going to be people that say, I don't believe that. What then?
Yeah, so why, so what gives the, whoever put this argument together, what gives them the right, the license to make this claim in the second premise? Well, Vaughan points out that here's where psychological egoism stands in as a necessary foundation, right? So then the suggestion is, we only get to premise 2 because of the work done by premise 1. Right? So we say, look, it's human nature. We can only act in a way that we perceive will benefit us, will give us our self-interest. So because of that, we are not obligated to act unless that action is motivated by this self-interest. And we've seen that we're not able to act except out of self-interest, right? So that's how we're able to produce and use the proposition in the second sentence here as a premise that would do the work of inferentially leading us, coupled with premise 1, to sentence 3. That is the conclusion. But that's exactly what I have in mind is fishy here. What is exactly the relationship between the first and second premise? And how does that give us the third sentence as the conclusion? Well, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it basically says we are only able to act out of self-interest. Therefore, we should only act out of self-interest. Therefore, we are morally obligated, ultimately, on the basis of that should, to act out of self-interest. Well, here's the problem. What's the sense of even using the second premise given the first? If the first premise tells me that I can only act out of self-interest, why should I say that I should act out of self-interest if I'm going to do it anyway? You see what I'm saying? It doesn't offer anything new substantially in the course of the argument. If you say humans only always act out of self-interest, and then you say you should act out of self-interest, it's like saying, I don't even try to come up with a good analogy to that. It's like saying you have to breathe in order to stay alive. Therefore, in order to stay alive, you should breathe, or something like that. You can maybe try to stop yourself from breathing, but usually, whether you like it or not, your body is going to force it, right? Or to say, human beings are incapable of flying like birds. Therefore, you should stay on the ground and not fly like birds. Well, you already told me I can't fly like a bird. So, okay, I will stay on the ground. It's not very useful. It's not very informative, right? It doesn't really tell you anything. And another problem with ethical egoism, if you even leave aside this issue, that is the problem of using psychological egoism as a basis for it, is since psychological egoism, well, actually, I want to focus on psychological egoism. Psychological egoism, since it's a descriptive theory, other scientific theories which are also descriptive, such as the example I gave of trying to explain why it is that cats purr, in principle, anytime you make a descriptive theory to explain some phenomenon, because you're trying to describe accurately the reality of that phenomenon, implicitly, there are counter examples that might arise. So if I try to say, oh, cats purr because of X, and then through my empirical analysis, I find some fact, and that fact falsifies the theory, I have to adjust the theory, right? But the problem with, so then in principle, every descriptive theory is revisable, right? This is a hallmark of science, right? So for example, gravity, how we explain the phenomenon of gravity, that is a theory. We take it as fact because it's so deeply entrenched and pervasively available for us that we don't question it. But that's not really what we mean when we separate facts from theories, right? In the scientific sense of theory. So in principle, any scientific theory as descriptive should be falsifiable. We should be able to entertain, even before finding counterexamples, we should be able to say, all right, here's my theory. This is how I'm going to describe or explain the phenomenon. But if I encounter this or this or this, that will show me that my theory is false. But when it comes to psychological egoism, any possible counterexample can always be explained away as instead an example that substantiates or justifies the theory. So if I say, as a counterexample, well, not all actions are motivated by self-interest. I helped this old lady cross the street or something like that. The psychological egoist would just say, oh, well, you helped her cross the street because you want to feel good about yourself, or you want other people to see that you're a good person. So anything you do can always be reinterpreted as self-interested or perhaps selfishly. So then there's no way you can possibly propose a counterexample, which means that as a descriptive theory, psychological egoism is useless, right? It will always justify itself as a theoretical account or description. So does that make sense? Okay. So that's what I meant by, in this slide, psychological egoism is often rendered untestable and useless. Every time you try to test it with a possible counterclaim or position, it just serves to justify or further endorse the theory under question. And then another issue, and so this is the last point I'll make about ethical egoism, is that right? The notion that we always act in such a way, even if it doesn't seem to be the case, because the action appears to be altruistic, that we always act because of desire, because we want to satisfy some particular desire of ours. So an example in the book is if you go into a burning building and rescue a child, that appears to be selfless or altruistic, someone might say, oh, you're just doing that because you want the satisfaction, or you want to feel good about being a hero, about saving someone. But that's problematic. As Aristotle noted thousands of years ago, pleasure and pain are always the byproduct of particular actions and decisions that we make. But that doesn't mean that those actions and decisions are made for the express or direct purpose of pleasure. That is, it's a byproduct. And as we'll see when we talk about Aristotelian virtue theory, this is really important because we ought to be very careful. We ought to be specially attuned to what we are by our individual natures attracted to as what gives us pleasure, because often we'll become obsessed with that and we'll seek it at all costs. Because pleasure, even if we're not directly looking for it, is going to be the byproduct of certain choices, just like pain is. But it's not sufficient to mark or determine a particular action or choice as either good or bad. It's simply a byproduct. So yeah, I desire to save the child from the burning building, but that's not because that action will result in pleasure for me. Yeah, that'll happen, but only because I originally had the desire, not for pleasure, but to save the child, because I'm such a person that feels happy when other people are not in pain or suffering. Okay. Yeah, so I'll jump past that to get into utilitarianism, but are there any quick questions about egoism, ethical egoism, or any comments about that? Okay, so utilitarianism is essentially a kind of democratic or egalitarian egoism, right? So what's the difference between an egoist and a utilitarian? Well, the only difference is, well, they're both consequentialists in that they focus on the results or consequences or effects of certain actions or decisions. And furthermore, they focus on the goodness of those consequences, effects, results, and so forth of actions and decisions. But an egoist is concerned with that goodness as qualifying their own pleasure, their own happiness, their own avoidance of pain and suffering exclusively, whereas the utilitarian has to take a more expansive view to consider how others are affected too. Okay, so that's why I call it a democratic or egalitarian egoism, where everyone who's potentially affected is considered. And so there are two versions or species of utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism says the morally right action is the one that directly produces the best balance of happiness over unhappiness, or pleasure over unpleasure, or pain for all concerned. And then rule utilitarianism says instead that the morally right action is the one that, if followed as or generalized, into a universal rule, would produce the greatest overall good. Again, all instances and everyone who's potentially impacted considered. So classic act utilitarianism, as proposed by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century, is built on the principle of utility. The principle of utility relies on the notion of the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So maximizing happiness, understood as pleasure. So here's Bentham, and here is his principle of utility. So by the principle of utility is meant that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever, according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the happiness of the party whose interest is in question, or what is the same thing, in other words, to promote or to oppose that happiness. By utility, and so this is a strange word in moral philosophy that doesn't mean what we typically understand it to mean in our everyday language, but by utility is meant that property in an object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness. And all this means the same thing, or what comes again to the same thing: to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. So going all the way back to ancient hedonism, the Hellenistic philosopher Epicurus primarily understood good as pleasure. So pleasure is the only intrinsic good, but pleasure really means the absence of pain, right? So for example, take into account the pleasure of food. So Epicurus noted that we primarily derive pleasure from eating, leaving aside the specific savor or qualities of this or that food that we might find attractive. But pleasure of eating comes about because when you eat, it gets rid of the state of pain of hunger, right? So you're hungry, that's a pain. So you eat, and now that pain is dissolved. Or you're thirsty, there's something lacking. You fill in that lack, now you're satisfied. So the tension or the deficiency has been repaired. So pleasure is really something kind of negative, not negative in the moral sense, but it really points essentially to the absence of pain, the removal of pain. And then in the next century, here is another famous utilitarian who did quite a bit of work to repair the glaring moral problems that come about from Bentham's approach. So Mill is the one who proposed rule utilitarianism versus simple act utilitarianism. So Mill modifies the principle of utility from Bentham and names it the greatest happiness principle. So he says, the creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And then by happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain, and by unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Okay, so is everyone clear on the greatest happiness principle and the principle of utility, what these principles which serve as the foundation for utilitarianism amount to? Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay. So here's some fun. So Bentham, and I think I mentioned this before, moral philosophers at this time were actually referred to as economists. And Bentham was an economist in the sense in which we understand that now, as well as being a moral philosopher who proposed this particular version, a formative or foundational version of utilitarianism. So he gave us what's called the Hedonic Calculus, or as it's labeled here sometimes, the philosophic calculus. And he actually thought that we could measure pleasure and pain with these discrete units, which he referred to as positive or negative hedons, right? So if I'm eating a sandwich, for example, I might be able to note the degree of pleasure I take in consuming the sandwich and quantify it and say, oh, I'm getting 4 hedons from this sandwich, right? Or if I'm walking my dog and step in a pile of dog shit, I might say, wow, I just had 2 negative hedons from that encounter, or something like that. So Bentham thought that we really could and should render through this sort of algorithm all these various considerations such that in a robustly objective sense, we can come up with some determinate outcome or judgment that would specify an action as good or bad. And so here's the calculus, and I'll talk more about that, but you might be curious about this image. So Bentham was a really funny guy. And before he died, he demanded, this was a part of his last will and testament, he demanded that he be preserved. So through taxidermy, he wanted his body to be preserved and kept at the university in the philosophy department in a closet, such that he could in the future continuously be wheeled out to oversee departmental meetings. But as you notice, for a while, he just had his head preserved here. So that's Bentham's actual head, where you see the cursor there. But for some viewers of the college, some members of the college, that was too grotesque, too macabre to have to look at all the time. So they removed his head and replaced it with this wax version, but then kept the head elsewhere. But it's kind of funny. So let me share the screen. Oh, hold on. Oops. I pulled up an image here. At some point, I think it was the 1980s, so the body and head were preserved at King's College in London, but some mischievous college students in the 1980s actually stole Bentham's head. And here they are described as masketeers with Bentham's head at a bar having fun, and they were of course caught and the head was recovered, and now it's more carefully protected and defended against such actions. It's not so easy to see his head anymore. So I just thought that was funny to share. Yeah, so that's Jeremy Bentham. So let me go back to the calculus here. But what do you guys think about that? Any thoughts or jokes that you want to throw out there?
I'm really glad that you shared that.
You appreciate that? Okay, good. So, so here's a breakdown of the calculus. So let's say you're confronted with a conundrum or some moral dilemma. You're not exactly sure how you should act. Well, Bentham thinks that you should run all of the possibilities through this algorithm. So because we're dealing not with egoism, we're dealing with utilitarianism, you have to take into account how not only yourself will be affected in terms of all these categories or criteria, but also how anybody else who's potentially impacted will benefit or the converse or be worsened by it. So you have to consider yourself, everyone else, and you have to consider from the point of view of positive hedons or pleasure, and from the point of view of negative hedons or pain. So here's an example I like to use that shows some deficiency in this. Let's say you're walking on the street, you find a wallet, you open it up, you find that there's $10,000 in the wallet, and now you want to see who it belongs to, so you check the license and it turns out it belongs to Jeff Bezos, right? So the owner or CEO of Amazon. So now you're wondering, well, what's morally obligatory here? Do I keep the wallet and the 10 grand? Let's just say, do I keep the wallet, which also has 10 grand, or should I return it? Well, to figure out what you should do, you have to run the scenario through all these categories, both for you, Jeff Bezos, and in terms of pleasure and pain. So you ask, in terms of Jeff Bezos himself, let's say I keep the wallet. Now in terms of the because this is more appropriate, the pain that Jeff Bezos might experience. So how long would it last? Well, for him, $10,000 is, like finding some spare change in the cushions of your couch, right? So you'd expect, he wouldn't really feel the pain for very long at all. How intense is it? Well, again, he might not even think about it. In fact, he might be more bothered by having to go to the DMV to get a new driver's license, right? So maybe that's some of the pain. Propinquity. So that means once the action is performed, how soon or late can I expect the pain or pleasure to arise? So you have to consider that. Extent. So how widely does it cover? So how many other people might be impacted by it? Well, you might think that Jeff Bezos could potentially use that money to, support hungry children or something. So, it might be a problem. So you give it, if you have like a scale of 1 to 10, positive or negative hedons. Let's say with duration, you say a 1. Or intensity, you say a 1. Propinquity, well, it might take him a little while, so a 3. Extent, maybe a 3 or 4. So how probable is it that the action will result in pain or pleasure? Then purity. So if I do perform this action and pain comes about of it, how clearly can I separate that pain from pleasure, right? And then fecundity. So will it actually contribute to more pleasure over time or more pain over time? So to cut to the chase, then I would have to go back and evaluate that in consideration of myself. So, I'm a poor philosophy professor. $10,000 would go quite a long way. So let's say I'll give that like an 8 or a 9 out of 10. It would be tremendously pleasurable. And so for all these reasons. So in the end, it might turn out that it would be morally for the good for me to keep the wallet rather than to return it to Jeff Bezos, right? But this is potentially problematic because by our ordinary moral intuitions, we would judge that to be the wrong thing to do because we would see it as an act of stealing or something, right? And so here's one issue with at least Bentham's version of act utilitarianism. It can sometimes justify or rationalize actions which on the face of them appear to be immoral or unjust or unethical. And we already looked at one of those actions earlier today in connection to the thought experiment about the heart disease researcher, Dr. X. Okay, so I've gone a little bit over time. So what we'll do is we'll pick up with this because I want to talk a little bit more about the difference, for example, between act and rule utilitarianism. So we'll spend some more time with this at the beginning of class Monday, and then we'll transition to Kantianism. And we'll likely have to continue to talk about Kantianism a little bit too on Wednesday before we get into Aristotle. But remember, we have one free day Wednesday, not next week, but the week after, which is when our exam is scheduled, to wrap up all of these loose ends, to pose and answer questions that you have. So we're a little behind, but we'll catch up in the next couple of weeks. So we're out of time, but does anyone have any final questions or comments before we go?
There was no class on Monday, right? Because of
Right.
Martin Luther King Day. I don't know if it shows up for anybody else, but for me in my Moodle, it like attendance does show up there like it was possible.
Oh yeah, it doesn't note. So that attendance, just as a reminder, is only there for the extra credit purposes at the end of the class. So I'll look at that in the end and know that, you know, there was no class on Monday anyway. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So last thing, I am going to create the groups. The people have spoken. It looks like we'll talk about abortion for our last ethical issue. So I am going to create those groups, and I'll send out an announcement when I do that so we can start putting them together. So if there are no other questions or comments, I hope you guys have a good rest of your week. Happy Inauguration Day. Have a good weekend. I will see you Monday.
See you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.